Two DEA agents lay in the desert dirt, shot twice each, playing dead until their kidnappers finally drove away. That gamble worked. Across 5 decades, cartels kept underestimating the agents sent after them, and the mistake kept coming back on them in manhunts, multi-million-dollar bounties, and decades inside a federal prison cell. This is 12 times cartels messed with the wrong DEA agent. Section 1. Michael Garbo. Michael Garbo built his career the slow way, one promotion at a time, long before most people outside the Drug Enforcement Administration ever heard his name. He started as a police officer with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department, spending 12 years on the force in Tennessee. 5 of those years served concurrently in the U.S. Army Reserve.
In 2005,
Section 1. Michael Garbo. Michael Garbo built his career the slow way, one promotion at a time, long before most people outside the Drug Enforcement Administration ever heard his name. He started as a police officer with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department, spending 12 years on the force in Tennessee. 5 of those years served concurrently in the U.S. Army Reserve.
In 2005, he left local policing behind and joined the DEA, and the agency assigned him to its Phoenix Field Division in Arizona, a posting that put him at the center of some of the busiest drug interdiction work in the country. Not long after joining, Garbo volunteered for a 2-year deployment to Afghanistan, working counter-narcotics missions in one of the most dangerous overseas assignments the agency offers. When he came home to Arizona, he was promoted to Group Supervisor, a role that put him in charge of coordinating operations rather than simply running them himself. Colleagues who worked under him would later describe his expertise and his manner as legendary, the kind of leader other agents wanted to model their own careers after. By October of 2021, Garbo had spent 16 years with the DEA, working everything from the Nogales corridor near the Mexican border to the mountains of Afghanistan. On the morning of October 4th, he was doing something he had done countless times before, something described afterward as almost routine. A regional task force made up of DEA agents from the Phoenix Field Division and officers from the Tucson Police Department was conducting an inspection of an Amtrak train that had just pulled into the downtown Tucson station. The train, called the Sunset Limited, was traveling from Los Angeles to New Orleans, carrying 137 passengers and 11 crew members. It had arrived at 7:40 that morning, and the inspection, prompted by tips passed along from Amtrak itself, began roughly 20 minutes later. This was the kind of quiet, methodical work that rarely makes headlines. Agents walking through train cars, checking luggage for contraband, cash, weapons, or drugs. The daily grind of interdiction that almost never ends in gunfire. That morning, it did. According to a federal criminal complaint released the day after the shooting, agents had detained one man during the inspection after finding drugs in his belongings. As officers dealt with him, a second man traveling nearby suddenly opened fire with a handgun. The gunfire erupted without warning inside a crowded train car, sending panicked passengers running through the corridors of the Sunset Limited as agents and officers scrambled to respond. Garbo was shot and later pronounced dead. A second DEA agent working alongside him was also shot multiple times, along with a Tucson police officer who was struck in the exchange. Both were rushed to Banner University Medical Center and listed in stable condition. The gunman did not survive the encounter. Several additional officers responded to the gunfire, and according to the federal complaint, the armed man was shot and killed after firing on them as well. He was later found dead inside a train restroom. Tucson police did not release his identity publicly in the immediate aftermath. The man agents had detained just before the shooting began, a passenger named Devonte O'Keefe Mathis, was arrested and later faced federal charges for knowingly possessing with intent to distribute a quantity of marijuana. A search of his bags turned up roughly 2.5 kilograms of raw marijuana, along with 50 individually packaged marijuana edibles and other cannabis products. Investigators later noted, according to court documents, that Mathis's name had appeared on a list of people agents were already investigating, a list that also included the name of the man believed to have opened fire on Garbo and the others. It is worth being precise about what this case actually was and was not. Nothing in the public record connects the gunman to a Mexican or Colombian cartel, and describing him as a cartel operative would not be accurate. He was, by every account available, a lone individual involved in drug distribution who chose, in a single violent moment, to open fire on federal agents rather than be taken into custody over what had started as a search connected to marijuana and related products. News of Garbo's death spread quickly through both the DEA and the broader Tucson community. DEA Administrator Ann Milgram released a statement calling Garbo's expertise and manner legendary, praising the leadership he had shown across the DEA's Nogales corridor operations and his volunteer service in Afghanistan. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey ordered flags lowered to half-staff at all state buildings until sunset the following day in Garbo's honor, a gesture usually reserved for the state's most significant losses. In the days that followed, more details emerged about exactly what had happened aboard the train, painting a picture of an agent who, even in the final moments of a chaotic gunfight, was credited with helping protect the far larger group of civilians who had been riding that train to New Orleans. Milgram specifically praised Garbo's actions that morning, saying they had helped save the lives of passengers and crew members who had simply been trying to get from one city to another when gunfire broke out around them. Garbo's funeral was held at Calvary Chapel in Tucson, drawing dozens of mourners along with law enforcement officers and federal officials from across the region. During the service, Pastor Jonathan Alameda told the gathered crowd that Garbo had lived a life devoted to serving and caring for others, a description that echoed the pattern of his entire career, from local policing in Nashville to counter-narcotics work in Afghanistan, to leading agents through some of the most demanding interdiction assignments in Arizona. U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco spoke at the service as well, addressing Garbo's family directly, saying she hoped they understood that his sacrifice belonged to them as much as to the country he had served, and that the nation would honor a hero who had given his life in service of both his country and his community. Multiple speakers during the eulogy focused less on Garbo's professional accomplishments and more on the parts of his life that mattered most to him personally: his role as a husband to his wife, Vida, and as a father to their teenage daughter, Alexis. More than one person who spoke that day recalled how Garbo would always find time to attend his daughter's dance recitals, no matter how demanding his caseload had become, and how he treasured quiet time with his family between assignments that regularly took him away from home. At the end of the ceremony, dozens of agents and officers formed up in a final line of formation as Garbo's flag-draped casket was carried out to a waiting color guard, accompanied by bagpipers playing Amazing Grace, a gun salute, and helicopters flying low overhead in tribute. The Amtrak shooting also reopened a broader conversation inside the DEA about the specific risks tied to interdiction work aboard trains and other forms of mass transit, an area of enforcement that involves far less control over the surrounding environment than a planned raid on a fixed location. Unlike an undercover buy or a coordinated warrant execution, An inspection aboard a moving passenger train puts agents in close quarters with dozens or hundreds of uninvolved civilians, with almost no advance warning about which passengers might be carrying weapons rather than simply contraband. Garbo's death, alongside the wounding of a second agent and a police officer in the same brief exchange, underscored how quickly a routine luggage check can turn into a life-threatening confrontation when a person facing arrest decides that violence is preferable to the consequences of being caught. Garbo's death is a reminder that the dangers facing DEA agents do not only come from the organized, patient violence of cartel leadership calculating whether killing an American federal agent is worth the cost. Sometimes it comes from an ordinary morning stop that goes wrong in an instant. From a person with far less at stake than a cartel boss, but with just as little hesitation about turning to a gun rather than facing arrest. Garbo had survived deployments to Afghanistan, worked interdiction along one of the busiest smuggling corridors on the southern border, and built a reputation across the agency as a leader other agents wanted to follow. None of that prepared anyone for a gunfight that broke out over a routine check of an Amtrak train stopped in the middle of downtown Tucson. And none of it changed how quickly that morning turned from ordinary to fatal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Garbo's death played out in a matter of seconds aboard a stopped train, the next case on this list goes back to the desert outside a small Mexican border town, where two agents were kidnapped, beaten, and loaded into a truck meant to deliver them to their own execution, and survived only because one of them made a split-second decision that changed everything. Section 2. Don Ware and Roy Stevenson. Don Ware had already lived a full career in law enforcement before he ever became a DEA agent. He started as a police officer in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1967, and not long after, he joined the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the federal agency that would later merge into what became the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973. By 1975, Ware was working out of the DEA's Las Vegas office, and he had built a reputation as a steady agent willing to chase leads that took him far outside his own territory. One of those leads came from a confidential informant who tipped him off about a heroin dealer operating across the border in Mexico. Ware traveled to Arizona to link up with other agents and Mexican authorities, putting together a plan to make a buy from the source the informant had identified. One of the agents who joined him was a man named Wilfred Stevenson, known to everyone as Roy, who worked out of the DEA's office in San Luis, Arizona, right on the border. The two of them were about to drive into the small Mexican border town of San Luis Rio Colorado in the state of Sonora to meet face-to-face with the very criminals they were trying to bring down. To understand how dangerous that kind of work actually was, it helps to picture what the drug trade along the border looked like in the mid-1970s. Heroin trafficking out of Mexico had been growing for years, and small border towns like San Luis Rio Colorado had become key points for moving product north. The DEA was barely 2 years old as an agency, and its agents in the field were still working out how to handle undercover buys in a country where they had no arrest powers and almost no backup. A buy operation, like the one Ware and Stevenson were running, depended almost entirely on trust between the agent and the informant, and on the agent's own instincts once the meeting actually happened. There was no team waiting nearby. There was no easy way to call for help if something went wrong. An agent walking into a meeting like that in rural Mexico in 1975 was, in a very real sense, walking in alone. On June 9, 1975, Ware and Stevenson set out to meet the heroin dealer their informant had identified. They never made it. Before they reached the meeting site, their vehicle was stopped by men connected to the trafficking organization they were investigating. The men ordered both agents out of the car and searched them for weapons. They found and seized the gun Stevenson was carrying. What they missed was the pistol tucked into Ware's waistband, hidden well enough that it slipped past the search entirely. That one missed detail would end up being the only thing standing between both agents and a quiet execution in the desert. Once the traffickers realized who they had, the situation turned violent fast. Ware was beaten badly. Both agents were forced into the back of a pickup truck, and Stevenson understood immediately what was happening. These men were not planning to question them and let them go. They were driving them somewhere remote to kill them and leave their bodies where no one would find them easily. Stevenson made a decision in that truck bed that would save both their lives. He asked Ware, quietly, for his gun. Ware handed it over. When the pickup finally stopped, deep in the desert outside town, Stevenson moved. He jumped out of the truck bed and shot the driver in the head before the man had a chance to react. What followed was a chaotic, close-range gunfight between two wounded, outnumbered agents and the remaining members of the kidnapping crew. Both Ware and Stevenson were shot twice during the exchange. Stevenson's wounds, while serious, were not life-threatening. Ware's were. He had taken bullets that caused severe internal damage, and he was bleeding badly in the dirt while the gunfight kept happening around him. In the middle of that chaos, both men made the only choice that gave them any real chance of surviving. They stopped moving. They stopped making sound. They let their bodies go limp and pretended they were already dead. It worked. The men who had kidnapped them, believing both agents were finished, left them lying in the street and drove off into the desert night.
Ware and Stevenson had survived an execution by doing nothing more than staying perfectly still while gravely wounded, surrounded by armed men who had every opportunity to make sure the job was finished. Help eventually reached them, and both were transported for emergency treatment, though the road back to normal life looked very different for each of them. For Roy Stevenson, the physical wounds allowed for a more straightforward recovery. For Don Ware, the road ahead was brutal. The damage from the gunshots was severe enough that doctors were not simply patching him up and sending him home. Ware remained in critical condition for months, undergoing extensive treatment and numerous operations to repair what the rounds had done to his body. By some accounts, his hospitalization stretched across roughly 6 months. He had qualified, under DEA policy, for a full medical retirement. Nobody would have questioned him for taking it. He had nearly died doing this job, in a foreign country, in a deal that had gone sideways the moment a search missed one hidden gun. Instead, once he was well enough, Ware went back to work. He did not return to fieldwork in the same way, but he stayed with the DEA, working out of the Las Vegas office for the rest of his career. He continued serving as an active agent for 20 more years after the shooting, finally retiring in 1995, a full 25 years after he had first joined federal narcotics enforcement. For his actions and his survival in 1975, Ware was awarded 2 of the DEA's most significant honors, the DEA Medal of Valor
and the DEA Purple Heart Award. He married and built a family with his wife Rita and 3 daughters, all of them living with a father who carried, quite literally, the physical scars of that night in the Sonoran Desert for the rest of his life. His widow, Rita, would later describe publicly how the ordeal left permanent damage that followed the family for decades. What happened to the men responsible for the ambush is its own slow, unfinished story. Unlike the Camarena case 10 years later, which set off a massive, internationally coordinated manhunt within days, the search for everyone involved in the attack on Ware and Stevenson stretched on for far longer, with far less public attention. Decades after the shooting, law enforcement officials were still working to track down the final suspect connected to the ambush, a detail confirmed by current DEA personnel who have spoken about the case at retrospective panels years later. Not every act of cartel violence against American agents got the kind of swift, headline-grabbing justice that followed Camarena's murder. Some cases simply moved quietly through the system for years, long after most people had forgotten the agents involved were ever ambushed in the first place.
Don Ware's story did not end with his retirement in 1995. Nearly a decade later, on October 12, 2004, Ware died on the operating table during what was supposed to be a routine hip replacement surgery. The official cause was medical malpractice, specifically a perforation of a vein during the procedure. On the surface, that death looked completely unrelated to a gunfight that had happened almost 30 years earlier. But the people who knew Ware best understood there was a direct line connecting the two events. The damage from his 1975 gunshot wounds had compromised his body in ways that ultimately required the hip surgery that killed him. It took years of advocacy from people who refused to let that connection be ignored. The Nevada branch of the Association of Former Federal Narcotics Agents spent roughly 2 years working to convince the DEA that Ware's death, even though it technically happened on an operating table decades after the shooting, was a direct result of injuries he sustained while doing his job in Mexico. They succeeded. On May 12, 2011, Don Ware was memorialized on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. The very next day, he was added to the DEA's own Wall of Honor, 36 years after he had been left for dead in the desert and pretended hard enough that he was believed. Don Ware passed away at 64 years old, having spent 37 years total in federal and local law enforcement, 25 of those years specifically with the DEA, after surviving an ambush that should have killed him on the spot. His story rarely comes up in the bigger conversations about cartel violence against American agents, mostly because it happened a decade before Camarena, in a much smaller town with far less international attention. But the bare facts of what happened to him and Roy Stevenson on June 9, 1975, stand on their own. 2 agents were stripped of one weapon, missed a second, beaten, loaded into a truck meant to deliver them to their own execution, and survived only because one of them made a split-second decision to fight back. And both of them had the nerve to lie motionless in the dirt while gravely wounded and surrounded by the men who had just tried to kill them. The traffickers who left them there believing they were dead had, without knowing it, let 2 witnesses walk away from a crime that would eventually earn Ware a place on the same memorial wall reserved for agents killed outright in the line of duty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Ware and Stevenson clawed their way out of a kidnapping nobody outside their own families ever heard much about, the next agent on this list was a week away from leaving undercover work behind for good, killed in an Arizona garage on the very last afternoon of an assignment meant to be his final one. Section 3. Richard Fass,
Richard E. Fass was 37 years old and a week away from moving his family to Mexico when he was killed. He had spent 8 years working undercover for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the kind of sustained, face-to-face work where a single wrong word or a moment of hesitation could end a life before backup ever arrived. By the summer of 1994, Fass had done that job long enough that the DEA was pulling him off the streets and moving him into an administrative position at the agency's office in Monterrey, Mexico. His wife and their 4 children were already packed and waiting, ready for the family to make the move together. He had one final undercover assignment left to finish, just one, and then he was done. Fass worked out of the DEA's Phoenix Field Division in Arizona, and in the months leading up to his death, he had been building a case against a Mexican drug trafficking organization run by a man named Agustin Vasquez Mendoza. Vasquez Mendoza led a criminal group that operated several clandestine methamphetamine laboratories in the Mexican state of Sonora, producing significant quantities of meth specifically for import into the United States. The organization did not just manufacture drugs. According to authorities who later prosecuted the case, it also specialized in robbing drug dealers, meaning its members were experienced in violent, predatory behavior against people who could not go to the police when things went wrong. Fass had penetrated that organization through undercover work, operating under a cover identity and building toward a buy that would generate the kind of evidence needed for a federal prosecution. On June 30th, 1994, Fass and his DEA partner, Special Agent Michael Pellanero, drove to an automotive repair shop in Glendale, Arizona, a suburb of Phoenix, to make a final undercover drug purchase. They were carrying $160,000 in cash, the agreed-upon price for 22 pounds of methamphetamine that Fass had arranged the day before with Vasquez Mendoza and an associate named Agustin Cuevas Cordova. What made the timing of this particular assignment so striking was that it was not just any ordinary workday for Fass. That morning, his colleagues at the Phoenix Field Division had thrown him a farewell luncheon, a celebration specifically because he was leaving undercover work behind for good, transitioning to a desk job in Monterrey. The luncheon ended around 2 in the afternoon. By 2:30 or so, Fass and Pellanero were driving to the garage for the buy. His colleagues were still cleaning up from the party. Pellanero showed the cash to Vasquez Mendoza's associate, Agustin Vasquez, confirming the money was real and the deal was ready to go. At 6:30 in the evening, Vasquez made a call to whoever was coordinating the handoff, signaling that the money was there and the transaction was good to proceed. 2 minutes later, at 6:32, Pellanero radioed all units to let them know the deal was moving forward. 3 minutes after that, everything fell apart. Instead of handing over drugs, Vasquez and a second man named Rafael Rubio Mendez forced Fass and the 2 confidential informants who were present into a back room of the garage at gunpoint. There were no drugs. According to prosecutors who later tried the case, there had never been any drugs. The entire setup had been a robbery from the start. Vasquez Mendoza, according to the government's account, had orchestrated a plan to steal the $160,000 in buy money from the DEA and to kill anyone who resisted. As the men tried to handcuff Fass, he made a decision in that back room that showed exactly the instinct that had kept him alive through 8 years of undercover work. He drew his weapon and shot at Rubio Mendez. Vasquez responded by shooting Fass multiple times at close range. Both Vasquez and Rubio Mendez then fled the scene on foot, leaving Fass bleeding on the garage floor. Pellanero, still outside with the other units, heard the gunfire and immediately called for backup. He then went into the garage and found Foss on the floor with multiple gunshot wounds. Different accounts describe the exact number of wounds slightly differently, but every source agrees the injuries were severe and unsurvivable. Foss died within an hour of the shooting.
His wife and 4 children, who had been waiting for him to finish this last assignment so they could leave together for Mexico, were instead told that Richard was not coming home at all. Within minutes of the shooting, federal agents were in pursuit of the men who had fled. At 6:45 in the evening, Vasquez was arrested near the crime scene. 7 minutes later, at 6:52, Rubio Mendez was also taken into custody. A grand jury handed down an indictment on July 5, 1994, just 5 days after the shooting, charging Vasquez Mendoza with murder, conspiracy, armed robbery, attempted murder, attempted armed robbery, kidnapping, and burglary. But there was a problem. Vasquez Mendoza himself, the man prosecutors described as the mastermind who arranged the robbery and instructed his people to kill anyone who resisted, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished and fled across the border into Mexico before law enforcement could reach him, leaving the 2 men he had used to carry out the plan behind to face the legal consequences on their own. The Phoenix DEA Field Division launched an immediate manhunt, working alongside the FBI and the Glendale Police Department's Homicide Unit. Rafael Rubio Mendez and Juan Vasquez Rubio, the 2 men arrested at the scene, were both prosecuted in Arizona. They were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison for the killing of Richard Fass. But Agustin Vasquez Mendoza, the man prosecutors described as the mastermind, was living freely somewhere in Mexico, beyond the reach of American courts. As months turned into years without a capture, the case drew national attention. In 1996, Fass's case was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, which helped keep public awareness of the manhunt alive at a time when Vasquez Mendoza had already been on the run for 2 years. The FBI eventually added Vasquez Mendoza to its official 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, making him the 445th person ever added to that roster. The DEA and FBI initially offered a combined reward of $250,000 for information leading to his capture. That figure was later dramatically increased to $2.2 million through a State Department counter-narcotics rewards program that Congress had established in 1986, specifically to help capture major drug traffickers. It was, at the time, one of the largest rewards ever offered in connection with the killing of a federal agent. The manhunt extended across most of the late 1990s. Investigators believed Vasquez Mendoza had received help from at least one family member from the town of Aguililla in the Mexican state of Michoacan in staying hidden and moving around. DEA agents believed the fugitive had been sheltered within a network of contacts connected to his drug trafficking background, making it extremely difficult to pin down his location through normal channels. But on July 9, 2000, 6 years after he had fled the garage in Glendale, Mexican authorities arrested Agustin Vasquez Mendoza in the state of Puebla, Mexico. He was taken into custody without resistance. What followed his arrest was its own drawn-out legal fight, one that dragged on for another 4.5 years before Vasquez Mendoza ever set foot inside an American courtroom.
The Mexican Supreme Court ruled that under Mexico's constitution at the time, the country was forbidden from extraditing suspects who faced the possibility of a life sentence without parole in the United States, on the grounds that such a sentence would eliminate any possibility of rehabilitation. This legal barrier meant that even though Vasquez Mendoza was sitting in Mexican custody, the United States could not immediately bring him across the border to face trial. To resolve the impasse, U.S. officials agreed to formally waive both the death penalty and the possibility of a sentence of life without parole as conditions of extradition, with prosecutors instead recommending a sentence of life with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
That concession was significant, particularly for the family of Richard Fass, who had watched the man responsible for planning their father's death remain free for 6 years, and then sit in Mexican custody for another 4.5 years, while lawyers argued over the terms of his return. Mexican authorities tried Vasquez Mendoza on a domestic drug trafficking charge first, concluding that case in late January 2005. Once that proceeding ended and he had been sentenced to time served on the Mexican charge, the legal avenue for extradition was clear. DEA agents physically removed Vasquez Mendoza from Mexico City and transported him to Glendale, Arizona, where he arrived on a Saturday in late January 2005, more than a decade after the night he had arranged to steal $160,000 from an undercover DEA agent and kill anyone who got in the way. A DEA official said at the time that Vasquez Mendoza's extradition served a notice that the worldwide efforts of the agency would be brought to bear on anyone who harms or kills an American agent, no matter how long it takes. A U.S. attorney called the day a good day for law enforcement. A county attorney described it as the culmination of a long and arduous investigation. Vasquez Mendoza was prosecuted in Maricopa County, Arizona, on the original 1994 indictment. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 70 years in prison. Combined with the life sentences already being served by the 2 men who had actually carried out the shooting inside the garage, the full criminal accountability for Richard Fass's death took just over a decade to complete, from beginning to end, across 2 countries, multiple court systems, 1 FBI Most Wanted designation, and a $2.2 million international reward. Richard Fass was remembered by his colleagues inside the DEA as one of the agency's most effective undercover agents, a man who had spent years doing some of the most psychologically demanding work in federal law enforcement, before he was promoted out of it and killed on the very day his time in those streets was supposed to be over. He left behind a wife and 4 children who had been waiting with their bags already packed for a family move that never happened. The specific cruelty of the timing, a farewell lunch in the afternoon and an ambush in the garage 3 hours later, is the kind of detail that stays with people long after the legal proceedings are finished and the names of the men convicted have faded from memory. What stays is that Richard Fass had already made it out. He had done the hard years, survived the undercover work, earned the desk job, and was a single afternoon away from a completely different chapter of his life with his family.
The men who planned to rob him that day were counting on an easy score from an agent they assumed would hand over the case without a fight. Instead, Fass drew his weapon and fired first. And even though it cost him his life, the mastermind behind the plan spent the next 6 years running, and the next several decades after that behind bars, for a robbery that never should have targeted him in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Fass never got the chance to see his own case through to its end, the next case on this list moves away from a single agent entirely
to the man who stood as the DEA's most trusted partner inside Mexico, collecting American law enforcement awards while secretly working for the very cartel he was supposed to be fighting. Section 4. Genaro Garcia Luna. Genaro Garcia Luna was never a DEA agent. He never even worked for the United States government. He was a Mexican government official, eventually the country's top law enforcement officer, and for years he stood as the DEA's single most important partner inside Mexico. While agents in the field were getting kidnapped and killed by cartels, the man controlling the entire Mexican federal police, the man the DEA gave awards to for his work fighting crime, was secretly taking the cartel's money the whole time. Genaro Garcia Luna was born on July 10, 1968, in Mexico City. He studied mechanical engineering at the Autonomous Metropolitan University and later completed a diploma in strategic planning at Mexico's National University. His career in Mexican law enforcement and intelligence began well before he ever became a household name. In 2000, he was named Director for Planning and Operation at the Federal Judicial Police, where he introduced new administrative structures. In 2001, he became the founding Director General of Mexico's Federal Investigation Agency, a position he held until 2005. His time there was not without controversy even then. In 2005, a kidnapping rescue operation broadcast live on Mexican television presented to the public as an unfolding real-time rescue turned out to have been staged, with the supposed kidnappers already detained the day before the cameras rolled. Garcia Luna also announced the arrests of 2 separate serial killers within the same week in January 2006, giving him a high public profile heading into his next, much bigger role. From 2006 to 2012, Garcia Luna served as Mexico's Secretary of Public Security under President Felipe Calderón, making him the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire country. In that role, he had direct control over Mexico's federal police force, the same organization that included the specialized unit trained by the DEA to work hand-in-hand with American agents inside Mexico. Garcia Luna became, by every outward appearance, exactly the kind of high-level ally the United States needed in its fight against Mexican drug cartels. The DEA gave him multiple awards over the years, specifically honoring his work fighting crime. At the very same time he was collecting those honors, according to evidence later presented at his federal trial in the United States, Garcia Luna was secretly working for the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful and violent trafficking organizations in the world. According to the evidence federal prosecutors eventually built against him, Garcia Luna used his official government positions to protect and assist the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for millions of dollars in bribes. This was not a passive form of corruption where he simply looked the other way. Prosecutors described active, hands-on assistance. His conduct, according to the case against him, included facilitating safe passage for the cartel's drug shipments, handing over sensitive law enforcement information about ongoing investigations into the cartel's own operations, and even helping the cartel launch attacks against its rival trafficking organizations, all of which helped the importation of multi-ton quantities of cocaine and other drugs into the United States. In exchange for their cut of the bribe money, members of Garcia Luna's own federal police force reportedly acted as bodyguards for cartel members, in some cases allowing actual cartel operatives to wear official police uniforms and badges as cover. Federal police personnel under his command
also reportedly helped physically unload cocaine shipments arriving by plane at Mexico City's airport, then delivered that cocaine directly to the cartel. The way Garcia Luna was paid, according to testimony at his trial, paints a vivid picture of how deep this corruption ran. He was paid in American currency, $100 bills bundled into stacks of $10,000 each, stuffed into suitcases, briefcases, and duffel bags, depending on the situation. The amount of money he received reportedly grew over the years as the Sinaloa cartel itself grew larger and more powerful, partly because of the exact protection Garcia Luna was providing. Former cartel members who later testified against him described handing off bribe money at a variety of locations across Mexico, including a safe house in Mexico City, where large amounts of cash were hidden behind a false wall, a car wash in Guadalajara, and a French restaurant sitting directly across the street from the United States Embassy. During the 2018 federal trial of Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin Guzman in the United States, Guzman's own partner testified that he personally had bribed Garcia Luna with suitcases stuffed full of $3 million in cash on 2 separate occasions, testimony that helped establish a public paper trail leading directly toward Garcia Luna years before his own arrest. Garcia Luna left his position as Secretary of Public Security in 2012 and moved to the United States not long after, settling into a life far removed, at least on paper, from his old role. In 2018, he took a significant step toward making that new life permanent, submitting an application for United States naturalization. On that application, prosecutors later proved Garcia Luna lied directly about his own past criminal conduct on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel, attempting to become an American citizen while actively concealing the exact corruption that was about to catch up with him. It did catch up with him. On December 9, 2019, Garcia Luna was arrested in the United States on charges connected to taking bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. He pleaded not guilty on October 7, 2020. His case moved slowly through the federal court system over the following years, eventually reaching trial in February 2023 in front of United States District Judge Brian Cogan in Brooklyn, New York. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and the government built its case around testimony from former high-ranking members of the Sinaloa cartel who had direct, personal knowledge of Garcia Luna's corrupt activities. Men who had once worked alongside him in the very arrangement prosecutors were now laying out for a jury. On February 21, 2023, that jury found Garcia Luna guilty on all 5 counts contained in his indictment, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, multiple conspiracy charges tied to cocaine trafficking, and making false statements, the last charge tied directly to the lies he had told on his citizenship application. The conviction made Garcia Luna, once the single highest-ranking law enforcement official in all of Mexico, a convicted felon in the United States, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life. Between his conviction and his eventual sentencing, Garcia Luna made one more serious mistake, one that revealed just how far he was still willing to go to escape accountability. While awaiting sentencing, the court found that he had attempted to obstruct justice by trying to bribe fellow inmates to provide false testimony aimed at overturning the jury's guilty verdict against him. The court took this additional misconduct into account during the sentencing process that followed. On October 16, 2024, almost 20 months after his conviction, Judge Cogan sentenced Garcia Luna to 460 months in federal prison, just over 38 years, along with a $2 million fine for what the court described as a decade-long pattern of assistance to the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for millions of dollars in bribes.
DEA. Administrator Ann Milgram spoke directly to the significance of the case at sentencing, stating that the outcome sent a clear message to corrupt leaders anywhere in the world who use positions of power to help cartels, that no amount of power would shield them from justice. She pointed out plainly that Garcia Luna had accepted millions of dollars in bribes specifically to allow millions of kilograms of cocaine to flood into the United States, and that instead of protecting the people of Mexico, he had spent years protecting the cartels responsible for harming them. Garcia Luna is currently serving his sentence at EDX Florence, the federal government's highest security prison, located in Colorado and reserved for some of the most dangerous and high-profile inmates in the entire federal system. His projected release date sits decades away, on July 19th, 2052, when he will be in his 80s.
Separate from his American prosecution, Mexico's own Attorney General's office had reportedly been looking into extraditing Garcia Luna back to Mexico to face additional related charges there. The fallout from his conviction also reopened old, unresolved political questions back in Mexico, with the former United States ambassador to Mexico stating in 2020 that she believed the government under which Garcia Luna served had known about his ties to the Sinaloa cartel while he was actively serving as the country's top security official, a claim that former administration has firmly denied. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
While Garcia Luna's betrayal unraveled through years of trial testimony from men who once worked beside him, the next agent on this list was a Mexican federal police commander personally trained by the DEA. A man trusted with the agency's most sensitive operations who broke down crying the moment an old friend finally confronted him with what he had done. Section 5. Ivan Reyes Arzate. Ivan Reyes Arzate was a Mexican federal police commander trained personally by the DEA and trusted with some of the agency's most sensitive operations in Mexico. His story belongs on this list anyway because it shows something just as damaging as a kidnapping or a killing. An entire DEA program built specifically to keep cartels out, secretly run from the inside by a man the cartels owned the whole time. Ivan Reyes Arzate served in the Mexican Federal Police from 2003 to 2016, working his way up through the ranks of one of the country's main law enforcement agencies. In 2008, he was promoted to a position that gave him extraordinary access and trust. Commander of the Federal Police's Sensitive Investigative Unit, known inside both governments simply as the SIU. This was not an ordinary police assignment. The SIU had been specially created for one purpose: to work directly alongside the DEA inside Mexico. And every officer assigned to it, including Reyes Arzate himself, was sent to the United States to receive specialized training from the DEA at its facility in Quantico, Virginia. The DEA relied on the SIU for some of its most important work in the country, including coordinated surveillance, joint operations, and high-profile arrests of major traffickers. Reyes Arzate became the unit's principal point of contact for sharing information with American agents, the man DEA personnel in Mexico City turned to when they needed Mexican law enforcement to move on a target or share intelligence. His direct boss, as commander of the entire federal police, was Genaro Garcia Luna, who held the position of Mexico's Secretary of Public Security throughout most of this same period. On paper, Reyes Arzate looked like exactly the kind of trusted, vetted partner the DEA's entire Mexico strategy depended on. In practice,
He was selling out that exact partnership for cash, and he had been doing it for years before anyone on the American side figured it out. During a meeting with Beltran Leyva organization leader Arturo Beltran Leyva around 2009, according to the federal criminal complaint later filed against him, Reyes Arzate revealed the identity of a DEA confidential informant, a man prosecutors described as having played an instrumental role in helping build an indictment against the cartel's leadership.
This particular informant was a Colombian man who had originally been arrested in Miami and had agreed to cooperate with the DEA, providing detailed information about how the Beltran Leyva organization was moving cocaine shipments north from Colombia. According to testimony given years later by a high-ranking Beltran Leyva lieutenant known by the nickname El Grande, the organization had grown suspicious after a string of their cocaine shipments kept getting intercepted, and cartel leadership held a meeting specifically to figure out how their operations kept being compromised. That meeting reportedly included Reyes Arzate, along with another senior Mexican federal police official who would later become a co-defendant in a much larger corruption case. According to testimony from that hearing, officials at the meeting identified the DEA informant and physically handed his photograph over to Arturo Beltran Leyva himself. Beltran Leyva, furious at the betrayal, ordered a lieutenant to kidnap the informant. Within days, the man was abducted, tortured, and murdered. Reyes Arzate and two other federal police officials involved in identifying him were paid $3 million total for handing over that single piece of information. This was not an isolated betrayal either. In 2010, according to testimony from El Grande at Reyes Arzate's later sentencing hearing, the Beltran Leyva organization paid $500,000 to Reyes Arzate and other corrupt Mexican police officers in exchange for help locating and arresting a rival trafficker who went by the nickname La Barbie and who was competing with the Beltran Leyva organization for control of valuable drug trafficking routes. That rival trafficker was eventually extradited to the United States and sentenced to nearly 50 years in prison, a case that, in a strange way, shows just how tangled Reyes Arzate's loyalties had become. He was not simply protecting one cartel from law enforcement. He was apparently willing to use his position to help one criminal organization eliminate a rival, all while officially serving as the DEA's most trusted Mexican law enforcement partner. For years, none of this surfaced. Reyes Arzate continued running the SIU, continued meeting regularly with American DEA agents stationed in Mexico City, and continued being treated as exactly the kind of reliable, professionally trained ally the entire binational drug enforcement relationship was supposed to be built on. According to later reporting, the moment everything fell apart came when a DEA agent who considered Reyes Arzate a close personal friend confronted him directly in a hotel room in Mexico City, having discovered evidence that Reyes Arzate had been feeding sensitive surveillance information to a cartel. Reyes Arzate broke down crying when confronted. ADE. A special agent later testified that, learning one of their most trusted Mexican colleagues had secretly been living a double life as a paid cartel informant, felt like getting punched in the stomach. A comment that captures just how personally devastating this discovery was for the agents who had worked alongside Reyes Arzate for years, believing they had a genuine partner rather than a man quietly selling their operations to the people they were trying to catch. Rather than waiting to be arrested, Reyes Arzate flew voluntarily to Chicago with the DEA agent who had confronted him and turned himself in to American authorities. Federal prosecutors unsealed a 42-page criminal complaint against him, accusing him of leaking crucial information to cartel targets during an undercover investigation, including revealing the identity of a separate DEA informant who had to be evacuated from Mexico entirely for his own safety once the leak was discovered.
According to the complaint, several other informants, including additional corrupt Mexican police officials, told American investigators that Reyes Arzate had been paid at least $3 million total for his betrayal over the years, the same figure connected to the murdered informant. In May 2018, Reyes Arzate pleaded guilty in federal court in Chicago to charges connected to selling confidential information to the Beltran-Leyva cartel and interfering with joint Mexican and American narcotics investigations. Federal prosecutors had originally pushed for a 10-year sentence. Instead, in November 2018, the court sentenced him to just 3 years in prison, a dramatically lighter outcome that prosecutors justified by pointing to the fact that Reyes Arzate had voluntarily surrendered himself in Chicago, rather than forcing authorities to track him down, and that he had since cooperated with the DEA.
His own defense attorney had argued for an even lighter sentence, essentially time served, suggesting that what Reyes Arzate had done was simply business as usual in a country where corruption inside law enforcement was treated as an unfortunate norm rather than an extraordinary betrayal.
That was not the end of Reyes Arzate's legal troubles. A separate federal case in the same Chicago court system focused on a different stretch of his corruption, connected to a drug trafficking network that moved cocaine and marijuana from Central America up through Mexico into Texas and California, working in cooperation with multiple major cartels at once. According to this second case, in 2016, while still serving as SIU commander, Reyes Arzate learned that American investigators were actively tracking that network's operations, and he accepted a bribe of $290,000 from people connected to it in exchange for tipping them off.
In October 2021, Reyes Arzate pleaded guilty to drug trafficking conspiracy charges tied to this second scheme. In February 2022, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for this conviction, though because he had already spent roughly 2 years in custody awaiting trial, he had only about 8 years left to serve at the time of sentencing. Speaking to the judge during that hearing, Reyes Arzate described himself as a man who did not run away from his responsibilities, language that stands in fairly stark contrast to a career built almost entirely on secretly running away from the responsibilities he had sworn to uphold as a federal police commander, trusted by both his own government and the DEA. Federal prosecutors and DEA officials were direct about how they viewed what Reyes Arzate had done. The United States attorney overseeing the case said Reyes Arzate had forged what he called a deplorable alliance with drug traffickers, betraying not just the Mexican people he had been sworn to protect, but also the law enforcement partners who had put themselves at genuine risk working alongside him to disrupt the very network he was secretly protecting. The DEA special agent in charge of the criminal investigation said that as a federal police commander, Reyes Arzate had essentially offered traffickers a perfect operating environment, turning a blind eye toward their activities while wearing the badge of someone meant to be hunting them down. The story did not stay contained to Reyes Arzate alone. Because he had served as SIU commander directly under Garcia Luna's authority as Mexico's top security official, federal prosecutors building the separate, much larger corruption case against Garcia Luna himself eventually drew a direct line between the two men's conduct.
Reyes Arzate, along with other former narcos and corrupt officials, was expected to testify or provide evidence in proceedings connected to Garcia Luna's case, helping prosecutors establish just how deeply compromised Mexico's own federal security apparatus had become at the very moment the DEA believed it had found its most reliable Mexican law enforcement partner in the fight against the country's most violent cartels. What makes Reyes Arsate's case land differently than most others on this list is exactly that sense of institutional betrayal rather than personal violence. Nobody put a gun to his head. Nobody tortured him into compliance.
The DEA had handpicked him, flown him to Virginia for specialized training, and built years of operations around trusting his unit completely. And the entire time, he was quietly auctioning off the identities of the agency's own informants to the highest bidder. Men who would go on to torture and kill the very people who had risked everything by agreeing to help American investigators in the first place. The cartel that paid him believed it had bought a permanent blind spot inside the DEA's most trusted Mexican partnership. Instead, it had bought a man who eventually flew himself to Chicago to confess everything, converting years of secret payoffs into 2 separate federal convictions and more than a decade combined behind bars. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
While Reyes Arsate's betrayal ended with a tearful confession in a Mexico City hotel room, the next agent on this list lived for years inside a country where the most feared drug lord on earth had a price tag on his head. And one ordinary night on a quiet road nearly convinced him that the contract had finally come due.
Section 6. Steve Murphy.
Steve Murphy's path into the DEA started on a police force most people have never heard of. As a teenager, he worked as an intern with the police department in Bluefield, West Virginia. And by 19, he had joined the force there as a uniformed officer, years before he ever set foot in Colombia. He spent his early 20s building a career as a small-town cop, and it was not until 1987 that he became a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration.
His early DEA work took him to Miami, Florida, right in the middle of the cocaine boom of the 1980s, where he worked undercover sting operations against traffickers. He once described how quickly the scale of his work escalated, recalling a case where he went from seeing 2 ounces of cocaine as the biggest bust of his career to suddenly being involved in an undercover sting that brought in 400 kilos, smuggled aboard a fishing boat rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. He called it addictive, in the sense that the adrenaline of the job pulled him in deeper and deeper. By the time the DEA needed agents willing to take on one of the most dangerous overseas assignments in the agency's history, Murphy had already proven he could handle pressure. In 1991, Murphy and his wife Connie made the decision together to accept a transfer to Colombia, the home base of Pablo Escobar, the leader of the Medellin cartel, and at the time, one of the most wanted criminals on the planet. Escobar had built an empire smuggling cocaine into the United States, and he had used an extraordinary amount of violence to protect that empire, ordering the assassination of Colombia's own Attorney General and orchestrating the bombing of a commercial passenger jet in 1989 in an attempt to kill a single political target who happened to be on board. Murphy was assigned to work alongside another DEA special agent, Javier Peña, who had joined the agency in 1984 and had already been stationed in Bogota since 1988. Together, Murphy and Peña became the lead American investigators assigned to track Escobar down, working as part of a larger joint task force between the United States and Colombia. Because of how dangerous the assignment was considered, DEA agents posted to Colombia during this period, including Murphy and Peña, were paid 50% more than agents working similar jobs back in the United States, a clear acknowledgement from the agency itself of exactly how much risk these men were taking on. The danger was not abstract or theoretical. Sicarios, the young hired gunmen recruited heavily from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, were paid by Escobar's organization to kill police officers, rivals,
and anyone else who got in the cartel's way. According to accounts later given by Murphy and Peña themselves, the going rate the cartel paid for killing an ordinary Colombian police officer was shockingly low, since the cartel viewed local cops as expendable and easy to replace. American DEA agents were a different story entirely.
Murphy and Peña have both said that contracts placed on their lives by Escobar's organization were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a price that reflected both the political weight of killing an American federal agent and the kind of overwhelming response such a killing would guarantee from Washington. Murphy has specifically pointed to one likely reason Escobar never followed through on those contracts the way he might have otherwise: the memory of what happened after Mexican traffickers tortured and killed DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena in 1985. The American government's response to Camarena's death had been so massive, so relentless, and so internationally disruptive to drug trafficking operations across an entire country that even a man as ruthless as Escobar appeared to calculate that actually killing an American DEA agent was not worth the consequences it would bring down on his own organization. The contracts stayed on the books. The agents stayed alive. But that did not mean the threat ever felt distant. And it certainly did not stop moments of real, immediate fear from happening on ordinary days in Bogotá. Connie Murphy made the choice to join her husband in Colombia rather than staying behind in the relative safety of the United States. And she remained in the country with him for the full length of his assignment rather than retreating home during the most dangerous stretches of the manhunt. While Steve spent much of his time working out of Medellin, embedded at a military academy alongside Colombian forces hunting Escobar directly, he and Connie kept an apartment together in Bogotá, and it was during one of Murphy's stretches back home in the capital that the incident at the center of this case took place. Murphy described coming home from the U.S. Embassy with Connie one evening, both of them tired after a long day, planning to take some of the back roads near a military base specifically to avoid the city's usual traffic, with a stop planned at a favorite restaurant to pick up takeout roast chicken and potatoes for dinner. It was meant to be a quiet, ordinary night, one of the few evenings they got to spend together uninterrupted, since Murphy's work frequently kept him away in Medellin for stretches at a time. He was driving one of the embassy's armored vehicles, an older model SUV reinforced for exactly this kind of environment. The vehicle had steel plates built into the doors, the floor, and the roof. The windows were made of extremely thick bulletproof glass, thick enough that they could not even be rolled down. The front and rear of the vehicle were fitted with heavy chrome-plated steel bars, and the entire vehicle weighed roughly twice what a normal car would weigh because of all the added armor. Murphy had joked to Connie before that the vehicle felt sturdy enough to survive almost anything. That sense of security was about to be tested in a completely different way than he expected. A blue Renault suddenly cut directly in front of Murphy's SUV, forcing him to slam on the brakes to keep from plowing into the much smaller car. Given how much the armored SUV weighed compared to an ordinary vehicle, Murphy understood immediately that a collision at that speed could seriously injure or even kill whoever was inside the smaller car. He managed to bring the SUV to a stop just inches away from the Renault. His first reaction, once he confirmed Connie was okay, was simple anger. The kind of frustration any driver feels after almost getting into a serious accident because of someone else's reckless driving. He started to get out of the vehicle, ready to confront whoever had just cut him off. That instinct disappeared the moment he actually looked up and saw what was happening outside his window. 3 men climbed out of the Renault and began walking toward Murphy's vehicle. They were dressed casually,
nothing that would normally draw attention on a Bogotá street. But as they got closer, Murphy could see that each of them had a pistol tucked into the waistband of his pants. In a country where Escobar's organization had standing contracts out on Murphy's life, and where DEA agents working the Escobar case lived with the constant possibility that any random encounter could turn out to be an assassination attempt in disguise, 3 armed men approaching his vehicle on foot right after forcing him to nearly crash was about as alarming a situation as Murphy could have walked into. He had spent years by this point absorbing the lesson of what had happened to Kiki Camarena less than a decade earlier, a fellow DEA agent kidnapped, tortured, and killed by traffickers in Mexico. Every agent working in Latin America after Camarena's murder carried some version of that fear with them. A constant awareness that the people walking toward your car with weapons visible might not be random criminals at all. Murphy did not wait to find out the hard way. He got Connie's attention, made sure she understood the seriousness of what was unfolding, and worked to get local police involved as quickly as possible. He told the responding officers exactly what he had seen, that the men in the blue Renault had cut him off and were now approaching his vehicle armed with handguns, and that, given his work investigating Escobar's organization, he genuinely believed these men could be sicarios sent to kill him. At the mention of guns, the police moved fast, surrounding the 3 men from the Renault and pointing their own weapons at them. It took a few tense moments for the full picture to come into focus. But once the responding officers realized exactly who Murphy was, and once they understood that he had direct contacts at the highest levels of the Colombian National Police through his work on the Escobar task force, their entire demeanor shifted. They began apologizing to both Murphy and Connie for the confusion and the fright they had just experienced. The 3 men in the Renault turned out to have nothing to do with Pablo Escobar at all. They were low-ranking members of the Colombian military, out on what amounted to a reckless joyride, driving carelessly and carrying sidearms simply because they were soldiers who happened to have access to weapons, not because they had been sent to hunt down an American federal agent. There was no cartel plot behind the near collision. There was no assassination attempt in progress. It had been, in the end, nothing more than a frightening coincidence involving careless young men with guns in a country where carrying a weapon barely raised an eyebrow. Once the situation had been fully sorted out and the police had moved on, Murphy and Connie drove the rest of the way home, both of them shaken by how quickly an ordinary errand for takeout chicken had turned into a moment where Murphy genuinely believed his life might be in danger. They sat together in their living room that night, eating their now slightly cold dinner straight out of styrofoam containers, with Connie pouring them both a glass of wine to help settle their nerves after everything that had just happened. Murphy has since described sitting there afterward, thinking about what the next close call might look like, and coming to an unsettling conclusion.
The armored vehicle he had been driving, with all its steel plating and bulletproof glass, had been built specifically to survive exactly the kind of attack he feared was happening in that moment on the road. But Murphy understood, sitting in his own living room with his wife, that no amount of armor plating was actually going to protect him if Pablo Escobar himself ever decided the political cost of killing an American DEA agent was finally worth paying. That moment never came, not for Murphy and not for Peña. The 2 of them continued their work hunting Escobar for the rest of the Joint Task Force operation, eventually setting up alongside Colombian Special Forces near Medellin during the most intense stretch of the manhunt.
Between July 1992, after Escobar escaped from the luxury prison he had essentially built for himself, and December 1993, when Colombian National Police finally tracked Escobar down and killed him during a rooftop chase through a Medellin neighborhood. After Escobar's death, Murphy and Connie returned to the United States, bringing with them 2 daughters the couple had adopted while living in Colombia. Murphy continued his DEA career for roughly 2 more decades after leaving Bogotá, eventually being promoted into the agency's senior executive ranks in 2009. Javier Peña stayed with the agency even longer, retiring in January 2014 after 30 total years of service.
In 2019, the 2 men co-wrote a memoir together about their years hunting Escobar, which is where this entire account of the blue Renault and the 3 armed men comes directly from. Told in Murphy's own words, Murphy's story is not a body count or a courtroom verdict. It is the simple fact that he lived for years inside a country where a 6-figure bounty hung over his head, where an armored vehicle felt like it might be his only real protection, and where one reckless near accident on a quiet back road was enough to make him believe for several long minutes that the contract on his life had finally come due. It did not.
Escobar's organization, for all its violence and all its resources, calculated that the price of finally collecting on Murphy's bounty was higher than the reward. And that single calculation, made by men who feared the consequences of repeating Camarena's murder, is the only reason Murphy got to retire, write his own memoir, and tell this story on his own terms decades later. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Murphy walked away from his close call with nothing more than a shaken night and a cold dinner, the next agent on this list built a life so extravagant on cartel money that colleagues were gossiping about his yacht parties years before any federal charge ever touched him. A slow-motion betrayal that took the DEA years to even notice. Section 7. Jose Irizarry. Long before Jose Irizarry became the DEA's own case study in corruption, he was working a very different kind of federal job. He spent time as a federal air marshal, the kind of work that puts a person through repeated security screening and background checks in San Juan, Puerto Rico, before he ever applied to the DEA. In 2009, the agency hired him. He worked as a federal air marshal, the kind of job that puts a person in close contact with security screening and background checks. In 2009, the DEA hired him as a special agent, even though he had failed a polygraph exam during the hiring process, a detail that would look very different in hindsight than it must have looked at the time. Irizarry was bilingual, sharp, and ambitious, and he landed an assignment that made him valuable almost immediately, handling undercover money laundering investigations, the kind of work where DEA agents pose as launderers themselves, moving cartel cash through fake businesses and bank accounts in order to trace where drug money actually goes and who controls it. He was first stationed with the DEA's Miami Field Division, a posting that put him at the center of some of the agency's biggest financial investigations into Colombian and Mexican trafficking networks. In Miami, Irizarry built a reputation as a rising star, someone overseeing undercover work that led to dozens of arrests. His bosses saw him as exactly the kind of agent the DEA wanted more of. In 2011, while still working out of Miami, Irizarry met a man named Marin, a Colombian who had built a career as a money launderer for what remained of the old Cali cartel. Marin had already drawn attention from Colombia's own police, who had publicly identified him as a major smuggler not long before he and Irizarry crossed paths. For a while, Marin was even briefly signed up as a DEA informant.
The kind of complicated, blurry arrangement that happens constantly in undercover drug work, where the line between informant and target gets murky on purpose, because that is often the only way agents can get close enough to gather real intelligence. But according to a later Associated Press investigation, Marin was not just providing information. He was actively working to corrupt the agents around him, using prostitutes, expensive dinners, and expensive gifts to build relationships that gave him cover and protection. Irisari became one of the people Marin corrupted most successfully, and the relationship between them grew far beyond anything resembling a normal source and handler arrangement. At some point, Marin became the godfather of Irisari's twin daughters, a detail that says more about how close this relationship became than almost anything else in the entire case.
Around the same time this relationship was deepening, Irizarry's personal financial life was falling apart. In 2010, he filed for personal bankruptcy protection. It is a detail that matters because prosecutors later pointed to this exact period as the starting point of his criminal scheme. A federal agent under serious financial pressure who had already failed a polygraph during hiring, who was now spending time with a wealthy and generous cartel-connected money launderer, was sitting in exactly the kind of position that makes corruption easy to slide into, rather than something that requires a dramatic single decision. Irizarry did not wake up one day and decide to betray the DEA. He drifted into it, one favor and one gift at a time, until the favors and gifts became something much bigger. What Irizarry actually did with his position inside DEA money laundering operations turned out to be staggering in scale. As a special agent running undercover sting accounts, he had access to systems meant to move and track drug proceeds as part of legitimate investigations. Accounts where cartel cash was supposed to flow through controlled channels, so agents could trace where it went and build cases against the people on the other end. Instead, Irizarry began diverting that money for himself and a group of Colombian co-conspirators. According to his own guilty plea and the federal indictment against him, he and his associates ultimately diverted approximately $9 million from undercover DEA money laundering investigations. To make this work without getting caught immediately, Irizarry and his co-conspirators used a stolen identity to open a fraudulent bank account, then ran diverted drug proceeds through that account. He filed false official reports about where sting money was going. He ordered DEA staff under him to wire money that was supposed to be used for undercover operations into international accounts that he and his associates controlled directly. The scheme ran across his entire time with the agency's money laundering unit, first in Miami and then later in an even more exposed posting overseas. In 2015, Irizarry was rewarded with a transfer to the DEA's office in Cartagena, Colombia, a city known as much for its beautiful Caribbean coastline and resort culture as for its proximity to ongoing cartel activity. For a corrupt agent already deep into a scheme built on diverted cartel cash, Cartagena turned out to be the perfect place to keep going. He bought a home there worth over $700,000 with sweeping ocean views and a rooftop pool that reportedly became something of an unofficial gathering spot for visiting agents and prosecutors passing through the region. He bought his wife a diamond ring worth $30,000. He drove luxury sports cars and traveled first class to Europe, carrying designer luggage, wearing an expensive gold watch. None of this looked like the life of a federal agent living on a government salary, and according to later reporting, plenty of people around him noticed. Stories about Irizarry's yacht parties and extravagant spending had become well known among other agents and prosecutors he worked with long before he was ever arrested.
Part of what made Irizarry's corruption so brazen, and part of what makes this case stand out, even among other instances of agency misconduct, is the lifestyle he and a group of colleagues built around their access to cartel money laundering investigations, something Irizarry himself later referred to in interviews as Team America.
The way Irizarry described it, agents involved in undercover money laundering work had effectively turned legitimate sting operations into an excuse to travel internationally and party at the cartel's expense. They picked cities for supposed money laundering pickups based on where major sporting events were happening, timing trips to coincide with soccer matches and tennis tournaments. Trips reportedly included stops in VIP rooms of strip clubs across the Caribbean, visits to Amsterdam's red light district, and at least one trip aboard a yacht in Colombian waters that launched with alcohol and more than a dozen prostitutes on board. In one specific incident, Irizarry later described in a memo asking the court for a reduced sentence, he recalled being in a VIP room at a Dominican Republic strip club in 2014 with another, newer DEA agent, racking up a bill of over $2,000 that was ultimately paid by a violent enforcer working for Marin. That younger agent later told the Associated Press that he had been new to the job and eager to work money laundering cases, and that he believed at the time these trips were legitimate official business paid for through proper DEA channels. This was not happening in a complete vacuum either. Around 2015, a separate DEA Inspector General report became public, criticizing agents for participating in what the report described as sex parties involving prostitutes hired by Colombian cartels, a scandal that existed alongside but distinct from the specific Irizarry case. One of the specific operations Irizarry was deeply involved in was known internally as whitewash. On paper, it looked like a major success story for the DEA, claiming 125 arrests, the seizure of over $100 million in assets, and the confiscation of nearly 9 tons of cocaine.
But when the DEA conducted an internal audit of the operation in 2020, a lengthy review found that Whitewash's reported statistics had been wildly inflated. A separate internal memo prepared for the agency's then administrator went even further, describing the entire operation as what the memo called a mirage, language that suggests the program had been presented to DEA leadership as something far more substantial and effective than what it actually was on the ground. Some of the inflated numbers became almost absurd under closer examination. For instance, roughly $30 million of the operation's total claimed seized assets came from 2 stolen paintings that Italian investigators had separately recovered from the villa of a different, unrelated drug trafficker entirely. A recovery that had essentially nothing to do with Whitewash's actual undercover work, but got folded into the operation's success statistics anyway. By 2018, the gap between Irizarry's lifestyle and his government salary, combined with the growing rumors among colleagues, had become too obvious to ignore. He resigned from the DEA that year, stepping away from the agency before the full scope of what he had done had been formally laid out in any indictment. That gap between resignation and prosecution gave investigators time to build a case, and in February 2020, Irizarry was arrested and charged. The charges against him were extensive, including conspiracy to launder money, honest services wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, and aggravated identity theft. On December 14, 2020, Irizarry pleaded guilty to all 19 counts contained in his federal indictment, admitting to the full scope of the conspiracy. His attorney told the court that her client accepted full responsibility for his actions, though she also argued his personal take from the entire conspiracy never exceeded $600,000, a figure noticeably lower
than the roughly $1 million in direct bribes and kickbacks prosecutors said he and his family had received, on top of the $9 million in diverted funds attributed to the broader conspiracy involving his Colombian associates. Irizarry's sentencing took place in Tampa, Florida in December 2021, in front of a federal judge. At the hearing, Irizarry broke down in tears, telling the court that the hardest part of his punishment was not the prison time itself, but having to explain to his two young daughters why their father would be gone for so long.
His attorney made an argument during sentencing that drew real attention, telling the court that when Irizarry joined the DEA, he was, in her words, schooled in how to be corrupt and schooled in how to break the law, describing an internal culture where accepting money and gifts from criminal informants had become normalized rather than treated as the obvious violation it was. The judge did not simply dismiss that argument. She expressed open disgust with the DEA for what she described as its failures in this case, and she stated directly that other agents corrupted by what she called the allure of easy money also needed to be investigated, telling the courtroom that this kind of behavior had to stop and that Irizarry was simply the one who got caught, not the only one involved. She sentenced him to just over 12 years in federal prison and ordered him taken into custody immediately. He began serving that sentence in early January 2022, after giving a series of lengthy, emotional interviews to the Associated Press in his native San Juan in the days before reporting to a federal detention center. What happened after Irizarry's sentencing turned this from a single corrupt agent's downfall into something that has continued to ripple through the DEA for years. Once he had pleaded guilty, Irizarry began cooperating extensively with federal investigators, spending what his attorney described as endless hours, providing information about other agents and prosecutors he claimed had participated in, or turned a blind eye to, the same culture of corruption that had consumed him. He alleged that as many as 24 current and former DEA agents and prosecutors had either joined in similar behavior or knowingly allowed it to continue without reporting it.
Some of his former colleagues have pushed back hard against these claims, calling them exaggerated or outright fabricated, suggesting Irizarry built up a narrative implicating others specifically to help reduce his own sentence. As of the most recent public reporting, beyond Irizarry himself, only his wife and a Colombian customs worker have faced charges connected to the broader conspiracy, though the Justice Department's internal investigation into other agents and prosecutors named by Irizarry has reportedly continued well beyond his own conviction. A separate Justice Department Inspector General report criticized the DEA more broadly for failing to properly oversee the kind of tightly controlled, undercover sting operations Irizarry had been trusted to run. A rebuke serious enough that the agency's then administrator ordered an outside review of its entire approach to foreign operations. The DEA's own public response to the case has been measured but pointed.
Following Irizarry's sentencing, Administrator Ann Milgram said her former special agent had abused the trust of the American people by repeatedly violating his oath as a federal law enforcement officer, while also stating that bringing him to justice reflected the values held by the rest of the agency's workforce. Homeland Security investigations, which had assisted in the broader case alongside the FBI and other federal partners, issued a similar statement describing Irizarry's conduct as an egregious breach of the trust placed in him as a federal agent, while emphasizing that his actions were not representative of the vast majority of government employees who do their jobs honestly. Irizarry's story lands so differently from the other cases on this list is exactly the absence of violence at its center.
There was no kidnapping, no torture, no gunfight, no funeral. Instead, there was a slow, almost mundane drift from financial trouble into bribery, from bribery into outright theft, and from outright theft into a lifestyle so visibly extravagant that colleagues were gossiping about his yacht parties years before any federal charge ever touched him. The cartel did not need to capture Jose Irizarry by force. It simply needed to be patient, generous, and willing to make a struggling federal agent's life easier, one expensive gift and one international trip at a time, until the agent meant to be hunting cartel money had quietly become one of the people moving it, right up until the exact moment that same generosity became the evidence that put him away for over a decade. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Irizarry's downfall took years to build and ended with him walking calmly into a federal courtroom to plead guilty, the next agent on this list was ambushed at a fake military checkpoint on a Mexican highway, forced to identify himself as an American diplomat to gunmen who answered with nearly 100 rounds of gunfire. Section 8. Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila. Federal law enforcement ran in Jaime Zapata's family almost like an inherited trade. He grew up in Brownsville, Texas, a border town sitting directly across the river from Matamoros, Mexico. One of 5 brothers who all ended up working in some part of the criminal justice field. Zapata attended Homer Hanna High School in Brownsville, then went on to the University of Texas at Brownsville, where he earned a degree in criminal justice along with an associate degree in applied science, graduating in 2005. From there, he joined ICE, eventually landing in the Homeland Security Investigations Division, the branch of ICE that handles transnational crime, including drug trafficking and the violence tied to it. By February 2011, Zapata had been with the agency for a few years and had built a career working exactly the kind of cases that put him in close, regular contact with the dangers of Mexico's cartel violence. On February 15, 2011, Zapata and his fellow HSI Special Agent Victor Avila were driving from Laredo, Texas to Mexico City on an assignment for the agency. They were in an armored Chevrolet Suburban, the kind of reinforced vehicle meant to protect federal agents traveling through dangerous parts of Mexico. And the vehicle carried official diplomatic plates, the kind that are supposed to signal to anyone paying attention that the people inside are protected under international law. As they drove through the northern state of San Luis Potosí, on a 4-lane federal highway called Highway 57 that connects Mexico City to Monterrey, the 2 agents noticed 2 SUVs following close behind them. The vehicles were moving fast, and Avila later described their driving as aggressive, the kind of behavior that puts an experienced agent on alert immediately. According to federal sources, the ambush took place near what amounted to a fake military checkpoint set up by the gunmen, who were dressed in camouflage and armed with machine guns. One of the SUVs sped up, past the agent's Suburban, and then gunmen inside opened fire on the vehicle. The attackers eventually rammed the Suburban off the road entirely. What the agents did not know in that moment, and what later trial evidence would reveal, is that they had not been specifically targeted as American federal agents from the start. The men attacking them were part of Los Zetas hit squads on an assignment that had nothing to do with Zapata or Avila personally. Some of the men later captured said they had been sent to steal vehicles for the cartel's own operations, and the armored Suburban with its diplomatic plates simply looked like a good target to grab. That detail makes the entire attack even harder to process because it means 2 trained federal agents ended up in a gunfight for their lives, and one of them ended up dead. over a car. Once the Suburban was forced off the road, the situation turned violent almost immediately. When Zapata shifted the vehicle into park, the doors automatically unlocked, a basic safety feature in most vehicles that, in this moment, became a serious problem. One of the gunmen pulled open the driver's side door and tried to physically drag Zapata out of the vehicle. Zapata fought him off and managed to get the doors locked again, buying himself and Avila a small amount of time.
The two agents then cracked their windows, hoping to talk their way out of what was unfolding around them. They identified themselves clearly as American diplomats, exactly the kind of declaration that, under different circumstances, might have made armed men think twice. As many as 15 gunmen had surrounded the vehicle by this point. According to the account Avila later gave, and according to testimony from a member of Congress who reviewed the case, the gunmen heard the agents identify themselves and did not care. One of the attackers reportedly responded with a dismissive curse, saying they did not give a damn who the agents claimed to be, and then the group opened fire. The gunfire that followed was overwhelming. Investigators later recovered roughly 90 shell casings from the scene, a number that gives some sense of just how much firepower was unleashed on two men sitting in a stopped vehicle. Victor Avila was shot twice in the leg and once in the chest.
He survived, and he was eventually transported to a hospital in Houston, Texas for treatment. Jaime Zapata was hit 3 times. Even with 3 bullet wounds, gravely injured and almost certainly aware of how serious his condition was, Zapata managed to shift the Suburban into gear and drive the vehicle forward, away from the gunman, before he finally collapsed at the wheel. A Mexican federal police helicopter arrived at the scene not long after, but it was too late for Zapata. Avila later described pressing down on Zapata's wound and trying to keep him alive during the roughly 40 minutes it took for help to arrive, calling that stretch of waiting an eternity. Zapata died from his injuries before anyone could get him the kind of emergency treatment that might have saved him.
The weapon that killed Zapata and wounded Avila turned out to have a paper trail that led straight back across the border into the United States. And that trail became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. The rifle used was a semi-automatic based on the AK-47 design. It had been purchased months earlier in Dallas, Texas by a man named Otilio Osorio. The gun's serial number had been filed off before it was smuggled into Mexico, along with 9 other rifles. According to congressional investigators who later examined the case, federal agents at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had already identified Osorio as a likely straw purchaser, someone who buys guns legally on behalf of people who cannot legally buy them themselves, months before he bought the gun that ended up killing Zapata.
This connected the case to a much larger and far more politically explosive controversy involving a botched ATF operation in which agents had knowingly allowed illegally purchased guns to cross into Mexico in hopes of tracing them to higher-level cartel figures, a strategy that backfired badly and resulted in American-bought weapons turning up at multiple violent crime scenes. Zapata's family later filed a lawsuit alleging that the weapons used in the attack had originated in Texas, demanding accountability for how American firearms kept ending up in the hands of the men killing American officers. The investigation into who was responsible moved with real speed and real coordination between the two countries.
The death of an HSI agent traveling on official assignment on a major federal highway in broad daylight put enormous pressure on Mexican authorities to identify and capture everyone involved. And the FBI led an investigation with substantial help from ICE, the ATF, the DEA, and the State Department. 7 Mexican nationals were eventually identified, located, and extradited to the United States to face charges. 2 of them were the men prosecutors said had actually been part of the group that opened fire on the agent's vehicle, and their case went to a full jury trial in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The trial began on July 10, 2017, and the government called 22 witnesses, including Victor Avila himself, who had survived the attack and was able to testify directly about what happened that day on Highway 57.
On July 27, 2017, the jury found both men guilty on 4 separate federal charges, including the murder of a United States officer and the attempted murder of an internationally protected person. Both men were sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison. 5 other men connected to the case pleaded guilty rather than going to trial, admitting to federal murder and attempted murder charges at various points between August 2011 and October 2016. 1 additional man pleaded guilty to a slightly different charge: conspiracy connected to running a criminal enterprise through racketeering, along with being an accessory after the fact. Separately, a high-ranking Los Zetas leader who has been described as having authority over the very region of Mexico where Zapata was killed, was captured and extradited to the United States in September 2012, pleading guilty to a federal charge of conspiring to import multi-ton quantities of cocaine and marijuana into the United States, though that charge was tied to drug trafficking rather than directly to Zapata's murder. The legal story did not end cleanly there either. In January 2023, a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. reviewed the convictions of the 2 men found guilty at trial and vacated 2 of their original counts, sending their cases back down to a lower court for resentencing, a narrower legal process focused specifically on how the murder and attempted murder charges should be calculated, rather than a full retrial of guilt or innocence.
As of the most recent reporting on the case, both men remained in federal custody, serving life sentences, while that resentencing process worked its way through the courts, more than a decade after the actual shooting on Highway 57. The killing of Jaime Zapata reshaped policy conversations in both countries almost immediately. Mexican officials called for closer cooperation between the 2 nations and promised to use every judicial and investigative tool available to find everyone responsible. In the United States, Zapata's killing reopened a long-running debate about whether American federal agents working in Mexico should be permitted to carry firearms for their own protection, since agents in Zapata's position had often operated under restrictions that limited what kind of self-defense capability they had while on assignment south of the border. Back home in Brownsville, an avenue was renamed in his honor, a small but permanent marker meant to make sure his name kept meaning something to the community that raised him. What happened to Zapata and Avila on that highway stands as one of the clearest examples of just how indiscriminate cartel violence in Mexico can be, and also as one of the clearest examples of how completely it can backfire. These 2 men were not undercover operatives who had spent years infiltrating a criminal organization. They were driving through cartel territory in a nice armored vehicle that a group of cartel gunmen wanted to steal. And when that vehicle turned out to be carrying 2 American federal agents instead of an easy target, the gunmen chose to open fire anyway, rather than let them go. Diplomatic plates did not stop it. Identifying themselves clearly as American officials did not stop it. But the men who pulled those triggers, believing a car theft in rural Mexico would simply vanish into the noise of the drug war, ended up hunted down by the combined weight of the FBI, ICE, the ATF, the DEA, and the State Department, extradited across an international border and sentenced to life in a Washington courtroom for a decision that took them only a few seconds to make on a stretch of highway they thought no one was watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
While Zapata and Avila never had a chance to do anything but fight for their lives in the span of a few violent minutes on a highway, the next agent on this list died at the hands of men who had no idea he was a federal agent at all. Killed in a Bogota robbery gone wrong on an ordinary night out after a basketball game. Section 9. James Terry Watson. Terry Watson grew up in a small community called Holly Ridge in Louisiana's Richland Parish, not far from Monroe, and built a career in law enforcement almost entirely by seeking out the assignments other people avoided. He graduated from Northeast Louisiana University with a degree in criminal justice and worked his way up from the ground floor of federal service. Before joining the DEA, Watson served in the United States Army and then spent 2 years from 1998 to 2000 working for the U.S. Marshals Service. In 2000, he joined the DEA and began his career with the agency, stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii, later transferring to a tour in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Watson built a reputation inside the agency as someone who consistently volunteered for the hardest, most dangerous assignments available, the kind of work most agents tried to avoid rather than seek out. That reputation showed clearly in his service record. Watson completed 3 separate deployments to Afghanistan as part of the DEA's Foreign Deployed Advisory and Support Team, a program that sent specially trained DEA agents into active combat zones to work directly alongside U.S. military special forces on counter-narcotics missions. During one deployment in 2009, Watson and the Army Special Forces soldiers he was working with came under fire from an estimated 500 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan's Farah province. A firefight serious enough to stand out even among the dangerous missions DEA's teams regularly took on. On other missions, Watson rappelled down rock faces roughly 3,000 feet high in mountainous terrain near the Pakistan border, specifically to reach and destroy hidden heroin production sites. Beyond Afghanistan, he volunteered for difficult assignments in Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, and Panama, building a career defined by repeatedly choosing the hardest job available rather than the safest one. By 2013, Watson was assigned to the DEA's Cartagena, Colombia resident office, working as part of a maritime drug smuggling investigation focused on tracking how traffickers moved cocaine by sea. On the evening of June 20th, 2013, Watson was in Bogota rather than Cartagena, there on official travel connected to his ongoing investigation. He spent that evening relaxing with colleagues from the U.S. Embassy at a restaurant, watching Game 7 of the NBA Finals, an ordinary, low-key night out after a stretch of demanding work. Watson had recently gotten married to a woman named Fadia Margarita de la Rosa, whom he had met during his time serving in Colombia, and, by all accounts from people who knew him, he had a deep appreciation for simple pleasures and a strong enthusiasm for life outside of work, despite the dangerous nature of his career. After leaving the restaurant that night, headed back toward his hotel, Watson hailed a taxi alone on the street, a completely ordinary decision that millions of people make every day in cities around the world without a second thought. The taxi that picked him up was not a random, honest cab. It belonged to a man named Julio Estevan Gracia Ramirez,
who was part of a coordinated robbery crew running a scheme well known in Bogotá at the time called a Paseo Millonario, which translates roughly to a millionaire's ride. The scheme worked by having a corrupt taxi driver pick up a passenger who looked like they might have money, then signal to a group of accomplices following close behind in additional vehicles. Once the timing was right, those accomplices would get into the taxi with the unsuspecting passenger already inside, and the group would kidnap and rob the victim, sometimes driving them around the city for hours while forcing them to withdraw cash from ATMs, sometimes simply robbing them on the spot. On this particular night, the full crew involved 6 people. Gracia Ramirez drove the taxi that picked up Watson.
A second taxi carried several of the other conspirators following behind, including a man who had helped organize the crew and had obtained disposable cell phones for the group to use during the operation. A third taxi was also part of the original plan, but that vehicle developed mechanical problems before the crew reached Watson, and the man riding in it ended up staying behind rather than participating directly in what happened next. When Gracia Ramirez's taxi, carrying Watson, stopped at a red light, he gave a signal to the trailing vehicle. 2 of the men from that second taxi got out and climbed into the back of Watson's cab alongside him. What followed happened fast and violently. One of the men used a stun gun to shock Watson repeatedly, while the other stabbed him multiple times with a knife. Watson fought back against the attack, but he was outnumbered inside a moving vehicle by men who had planned exactly this kind of ambush. Despite his injuries, Watson managed to get out of the taxi and ran roughly a block away from the scene before he finally collapsed from the wounds he had sustained. Bystanders nearby saw what had happened and came to help him, but Watson's injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead after arriving at the hospital at 42 years old. The investigation into Watson's murder moved with serious urgency and full cooperation between American and Colombian authorities. Within weeks, Bogotá police had identified and arrested members of the crew responsible, and the U.S. Department of Justice made clear its intention to pursue extradition so the men involved could face trial in the United States rather than solely through the Colombian legal system. By July 2013, 6 Colombians connected to the crime had been indicted on charges related to Watson's kidnapping and murder. A 7th man was identified separately, not as one of the original 6 robbery crew members, but as someone who had helped cover up the crime afterward, cleaning the taxicab where the attack happened and scrubbing away Watson's blood from the back seat before eventually turning the vehicle in to the Colombian National Police, an attempt to destroy evidence before investigators could examine it properly. All 7 men were extradited from Colombia to the United States to face federal charges in the Eastern District of Virginia. What followed was a series of guilty pleas rather than a single courtroom trial, with each defendant eventually admitting their specific role in the conspiracy. Gracia Ramirez, the driver who had picked up Watson in the first place, pleaded guilty in September 2014 to aiding and abetting the murder of an internationally protected person, along with conspiracy to kidnap an internationally protected person.
He was sentenced that December to 27 years in prison.
The driver of the second taxi was sentenced the same day to 25 years. The man whose taxi had broken down before he could join the actual attack was still held responsible as part of the broader conspiracy and was sentenced to 20 years. The man who had used the stun gun on Watson pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting murder, along with kidnapping conspiracy charges, and was sentenced in February 2015 to 30 years. The 2 men whose roles in the attack went deepest received the longest sentences of the group. The man who had helped organize the entire crew and supplied the disposable phones used to coordinate the attack pleaded guilty in December 2014 to second-degree murder and conspiracy to kidnap an internationally protected person, and was sentenced to roughly 29 years in prison.
The man who actually stabbed Watson pleaded guilty to the same charges and received the harshest sentence of anyone involved in the case. Just under 37 years. The man who cleaned the taxi and helped conceal evidence after the killing, rather than taking part in the attack itself, pleaded guilty to a single charge of obstruction of justice and received a far lighter sentence, a little over 3 years. By the time the final 2 sentences were handed down in early 2015, all 7 men connected to Terry Watson's death had been identified, extradited, prosecuted, and sentenced, closing out a case that the Department of Justice described as having brought every single person responsible to justice. The Attorney General at the time spoke about Watson's service directly at multiple points during the prosecution, describing his career as both selfless and courageous.
The DEA administrator echoed that sentiment, calling Watson a courageous and accomplished agent whose career and ultimate sacrifice the agency would remember permanently. Back home, the response to Watson's death reflected just how deeply his loss was felt by the community that had raised him. His memorial service was held at the Richland Arts Center in Rayville, Louisiana, close to Holly Ridge, where he had grown up. His family released a statement at the service, describing how Watson had dedicated his life to serving the public and making the world safer, adding that he had never wasted a single minute of his life and never taken it for granted. A close friend and fellow DEA agent spoke at the service as well, telling the crowd that the world was a better place for having had Terry Watson in it. In 2016, a section of Louisiana Route 183 running through Richland Parish was officially renamed the James Terry Watson Memorial Highway, giving his hometown a permanent, physical reminder of the agent they had lost. Watson was survived by his wife, his parents, his stepmother, his brother, and other close family members who continue to keep his memory alive through organizations supporting fallen federal agents and their families. Terry Watson's case lands the way it does isn't the violence itself, which was every bit as brutal and senseless as anything described elsewhere on this list. It's the fact that the men who killed him were never connected to any specific cartel, never received orders from any drug trafficking organization, and by every piece of evidence gathered during the investigation, had absolutely no idea they had just killed a U.S. federal agent, until long after it was too late to matter.
They picked a tired man walking out of a restaurant after a basketball game because he looked like an easy target.
And that single miscalculation brought the full weight of American federal law enforcement down on all 7 of them, from a Bogota street corner to a Virginia courtroom, in less time than it took Watson's widow to plan his memorial back home in Louisiana. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Watson's death came from a robbery crew that had no idea who they were actually killing, the next agent on this list was shot dead by a mob-connected trafficker during an undercover buy on Staten Island, a killing that triggered a manhunt so intense his own associates decided he was safer dead than alive.
Section 10. Everett Hatcher. Everett Hatcher was born on October 9, 1942, and by the time he became a Drug Enforcement Administration special agent, he had already lived several careers. He earned a bachelor's degree from Hampton Institute in Virginia and a master's degree from Boston College, and before any of that, he served in the United States Army in Germany as a deputy provost marshal,
while also teaching physical education at a school for military families overseas. When he returned to New York in the mid-1970s, he taught in the city's public schools, then worked as an investigator for the New York County District Attorney's Office. He joined the DEA in 1977, bringing with him a background that mixed law enforcement, education, and military discipline in a way few of his colleagues could match. By 1989, he had spent 12 years with the agency, working out of the DEA's New York Field Division. At the time, Hatcher was investigating a man named Gerard Chili, a figure connected to organized crime in New York. One of Chili's associates was a man named Costabile Farace, known to people around him as Gus. Farace was not a cartel operative in the way most people picture when they hear that word. He was a violent, small-time trafficker with a serious criminal record, including a prior conviction for murder and kidnapping, who had been released on parole in June of 1988 after serving 8 years. Almost immediately after his release, Farace went back to selling cocaine and marijuana, and by early 1989, he had become someone worth watching for the DEA in New York. Hatcher, working undercover, arranged to buy cocaine from Farace. The two men met on multiple occasions to discuss the deal, building toward a purchase that would give investigators the evidence they needed. This was their third meeting. On the evening of February 28, 1989, at around 9 o'clock, Hatcher drove to a remote overpass on the West Shore Expressway in the Rossville section of Staten Island to meet Farace and finalize the transaction. Hatcher was wearing a hidden transmitter, and he had 5 backup officers positioned nearby, the standard precautions for an undercover buy involving a target with a documented history of violence. At some point during the meeting, contact with Hatcher was lost. Without any warning, Farace pulled the .357 Magnum handgun and shot Hatcher several times, killing him on the spot. It was the first murder of a DEA agent in New York City since 1972, and Hatcher is believed to have been the first law enforcement officer killed in the line of duty on Staten Island. The response from federal and local law enforcement was immediate and overwhelming. Assisted by every law enforcement agency in the New York City area, the DEA spearheaded a massive manhunt for Farace. The FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list. Local and federal agents ramped up surveillance on organized crime figures across the city, stopping known associates to take photographs and ask questions, treating the killing of a federal agent as an attack that demanded a response reaching far beyond the drug case Hatcher had originally been building. A week after the murder, information about the case aired on the television program America's Most Wanted, putting Farace's face in front of a national audience and turning an already intense search into a very public one. What happened next is where this case becomes something more than a simple manhunt story. Farace was not just wanted by federal agents. He was also, according to reporting on the case, wanted by his own associates in organized crime, and for reasons that had nothing to do with loyalty to him. After the murder, Farace went into hiding, first staying with an old girlfriend connected to the Chili family. Police soon raided that hideout and made an arrest, and at the scene, a DEA official reportedly told Chili that he could place the blame for the raid on Farace himself. That comment, whether intended this way or not, seems to have pushed Chili toward a decision. Furious at the heat Farace had brought down on everyone around him, Chili wanted Farace killed, and he pressed a mob associate to carry it out. That associate refused, and months later, according to reporting on the case, he himself was found dead with a hood placed over his head, a message inside organized crime circles about the danger of keeping secrets from the family.
The pressure Farage's actions had put on everyone connected to him kept building, with no clean way out for anyone involved. As the search for Farage stretched on, law enforcement kept increasing the pressure on organized crime figures across New York. And inside those same circles, the calculation about what to do with Farage kept shifting. According to reporting on the case, the leadership of the Bonanno crime family, an organization Farage had connections to, eventually decided he had become too dangerous to leave alive. He had killed a federal agent, brought a nationwide manhunt down on everyone he knew, and turned himself into exactly the kind of liability that organized crime figures have never tolerated for long. Farage's ties to people in that world had also grown strained for reasons unrelated to the murder itself. He had recently married, and members of one associated family reportedly kept their distance from the wedding, wary of being tied too closely to a man now at the center of a federal manhunt, in part because it risked sending a family member already convicted on drug charges to a far more distant, more restrictive federal prison if the connections grew any deeper. The search for Farage ended less than 10 months after Hatcher's murder. At approximately 11 o'clock at night on November 17, 1989, police dispatchers in Brooklyn received a 911 call about a car parked on a street in the Bensonhurst section of the borough. According to witnesses, a van had pulled alongside Farage's car and opened fire, shooting the two men inside 9 times, the same method Farage himself had used to kill Agent Hatcher months earlier. Farage was still alive when police arrived. Officers placed him in a trauma unit, but he died on the way to the hospital.
The other man in the car, an associate of Farage's organization, survived the attack, having been shot clean out of his own shoes by the force of the gunfire, and told investigators he had managed to fire 2 shots back at the assailants before they fled. Farage's death closed the manhunt, but it did not bring any conventional sense of justice. There was no trial, no jury, no sentencing hearing where a judge addressed the weight of what he had done. Instead, the very world Farage had operated inside of decided that the cost of keeping him alive had grown too high, and it disposed of him the same way it disposes of any liability it can no longer afford to protect. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York refused to grant Farage a public funeral mass, citing what it described as his notorious life and death, though it did permit his remains to be buried in a church-owned cemetery on Staten Island, in the same area where he had killed Hatcher months earlier. For Everett Hatcher's family and colleagues, none of this changed what had been taken from them. Hatcher was survived by his wife and 2 sons. He had spent his entire adult life moving from one form of public service to another: soldier, teacher, investigator, and finally, federal agent. And he was 46 years old when Farage shot him at that overpass on the West Shore Expressway. In 1996, New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani unveiled a street sign honorarily naming the block outside the DEA's New York regional office as Special Agent Everett Hatcher Way, giving his name a permanent place in the city where he had spent his career. He is remembered today on the DEA's Wall of Honor, alongside the other agents who never came home, and current agents still write about him in personal tributes decades later, describing handcuffs inscribed with his name and his end-of-watch date, passed down and explained to newer agents who never had the chance to meet him. He was a violent, mid-level trafficker with mob connections, operating in New York rather than Mexico or Colombia. And it matters to say that plainly, rather than let the story blur into something it was not. But the shape of what happened to him afterward tracks the same pattern that shows up again and again across this list. A man decided that killing a federal agent would solve his immediate problem and simply disappear into the noise of ordinary street crime. Instead, it brought the full weight of the FBI's 10 most wanted list down on him,
turned him into a national manhunt target broadcast on network television, and made him so radioactive to the very criminal network that had once protected him that his own associates decided the safest thing to do with Costabile Farace was exactly what he had done to Everett Hatcher on that overpass less than a year after he pulled the trigger. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing.
It helps the channel tremendously. While Farace's own associates eventually decided he had become too dangerous to keep alive, the next case on this list turns to a fentanyl network built by the sons of Mexico's most infamous drug lord, and two confidential sources who vanished from inside that organization right as the biggest indictment of a senator's career became public. Section 11. The DEA. Sources inside Los Chapitos. To understand the story, it helps to know who Los Chapitos are. The name refers to sons connected to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa cartel leader convicted in a U.S. court in 2019. Several of them inherited large portions of their father's drug trafficking empire and built it into one of the most aggressive fentanyl distribution networks moving product into the United States.
American law enforcement had already brought drug trafficking charges against several of the brothers back in 2018 and 2019. But none of those earlier charges involved fentanyl specifically, the synthetic opioid that has driven an unprecedented wave of overdose deaths across the United States in recent years. Multiple federal agencies were working their own angles on Los Chapitos at the same time, and according to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, that overlapping effort is exactly where things started going wrong. Homeland Security investigations, working alongside the FBI, had built its own case against the Chapitos brothers, an effort that included an operation targeting the network's leadership directly. On January 5, 2023, that effort coordinated with Mexican authorities to arrest Ovidio Guzman Lopez in the town of Jesus Maria in the Mexican state of Sinaloa.
That arrest connected directly to a joint, superseding indictment that federal prosecutors had actually obtained back on December 14, 2022, charging all four Chapitos brothers with 36 separate violations under a federal law called the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, a charge that carries a potential sentence of life in prison. Evidence gathered through that HSI-led operation accounted for 11 of those 36 charged violations. Notably, the DEA was not listed anywhere on that particular indictment as having taken part in building the case. Here is where the timeline gets complicated and, according to Grassley, deeply troubling. That December 2022 indictment was not actually unsealed and made public right away. It sat for 4 months before finally becoming public on April 14, 2023, in the Southern District of New York, charging 3 of the 4 brothers with fentanyl trafficking. On that exact same day, DEA Administrator Ann Milgram held a separate public announcement stating that her agency had successfully infiltrated the Sinaloa cartel and the Chapitos organization at the highest levels, claiming credit for major access inside the network. According to Grassley's letter, the DEA had developed its own competing investigation into the same targets, and rather than letting the HSI and FBI case move forward on its own established timeline, the Justice Department reportedly paused arrest efforts across other agencies, specifically to give the DEA's separate, unilateral investigation more time to develop. Grassley framed this as the Justice Department effectively choosing to defer to the DEA's slower-moving case over investigations from other agencies that were, according to him, already prepared to move forward months earlier.
The most serious claim in Grassley's letter, dated August 21, 2023, and sent directly to Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, is this. According to information his office had received, 2 cooperating sources that the DEA had placed inside the Los Chapitos network had been murdered in Mexico. And this happened during the exact period when the Justice Department was reportedly giving the DEA additional time to keep developing its own investigation, rather than moving forward with charges that other agencies already had ready. Grassley's letter put it directly, stating that despite these deaths, the Deputy Attorney General's office reportedly continued giving the DEA more time to pursue its unilateral approach. He demanded answers about exactly what had happened, what role the U.S.
Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York may have played in decisions connected to the cooperators' deaths, and why the Justice Department continued backing the DEA's approach even after, according to his information, 2 people working as DEA assets had already been killed. When journalists with the Mexican outlet Grupo Reforma reached out to Senator Grass's office for more specifics, his staff said they could not share details about the underlying sources that had provided information about the deaths of the 2 informants, while still maintaining that the senator was determined to hold the Justice Department accountable for what had happened. As of that reporting, the Justice Department had not responded publicly to Reforma's request for comment on the allegations. This is an important detail worth sitting with for a moment.
A sitting U.S. Senator made a specific written claim to the Deputy Attorney General about 2 deaths connected to a federal law enforcement operation, and the Department of Justice, as far as public reporting shows, never issued a clear public confirmation or denial of that specific claim. Some additional reporting helps fill in a little more context about what the DEA's informant network inside Los Chapitos actually looked like, even without confirming the identities of anyone who may have died. According to Mexican journalist Penileve Ramirez, writing for Reforma, the DEA maintained at least 3 separate sources embedded deep inside the close inner circle of Los Chapitos. Sources who, between 2017 and 2022, reportedly delivered recordings, photographs of locations and vehicles, and information about the identities of associates and the locations of drug labs. These sources had reportedly recorded conversations involving Ovidio Guzman himself for roughly 3 years leading up to his eventual arrest. One especially detailed account from this reporting describes a meeting in May 2022 at a remote ranch in Sinaloa, where Ovidio Guzman, known by the nickname El Raton, met with high-level cartel figures surrounded by more than 40 armed men and 6 armored trucks equipped with mounted machine guns. According to this account, DEA informants were present among the security personnel at that meeting. Ovidio reportedly told the group he was working to centralize fentanyl manufacturing within Sinaloa and expressed specific concern about being tracked by DEA surveillance. All while, according to the same reporting, at least 1 person in that heavily armed room may have been secretly reporting back to the very agency he feared. At that same meeting, Ovidio reportedly closed a drug distribution deal with a buyer based in Los Angeles. The reporting also notes that the DEA's 3 confirmed sources inside the network were still active as of at least May 2021, a detail that, when laid next to Grassley's later claim that 2 cooperators had been killed sometime before August 2023, leaves a real, unresolved gap in the public timeline about exactly when and how those alleged deaths actually happened. A separate Treasury Department Inspector General report, cited in reporting connected to this story, found that federal agencies, including the DEA, have at times relied on individual confidential informants for staggering lengths of time and staggering amounts of money, including one source the DEA reportedly paid roughly $30 million across 30 years of service, an average of about $1 million annually for a single person's information. Other reporting connected to this broader pattern points back to much older, deeply troubling cases from earlier decades involving different federal informants who were allowed to continue committing serious crimes while still collecting payment and protection from the U.S. government.
None of that older history is the same as what allegedly happened to the two Chapitos Network cooperators Grassley described, but it shows a documented, long-running pattern of American agencies sometimes losing control over exactly what their paid sources are doing and exactly how much danger those sources are actually in. What the DEA has stated publicly about its overall work against Los Chapitos, separate from any specific informant deaths, paints a picture of an agency claiming real, substantial success.
In testimony connected to the Department of Justice in 2024, DEA leadership stated that the agency's broader strategy against the Chapitos network of the Sinaloa Cartel had resulted in charges against 28 members and associates connected to the organization, spanning everyone from chemical suppliers based in China to a broker in Guatemala helping move materials into Mexico, lab operators converting raw chemicals into finished fentanyl pills and powder, weapons traffickers, and money launderers moving drug proceeds back across the border. The agency reported seizing more than 79 million fake fentanyl pills and nearly 12,000 pounds of fentanyl powder in 2023 alone. Numbers the DEA itself translated into more than 380 million potentially deadly doses kept off American streets. These are real, documented enforcement numbers, tied to actual public statements from DEA leadership. They simply do not address, one way or another, the specific allegation Grassley raised about two cooperators allegedly losing their lives somewhere along the way. This case sits in an uncomfortable, unresolved place, and it deserves to be presented that way rather than dressed up with invented details just to make it feel more complete. A United States senator with direct oversight authority over the Justice Department formally alleged that two people working secretly for the DEA inside one of the most violent fentanyl trafficking networks on Earth were killed, and that federal officials kept supporting the DEA's approach even after learning about those deaths. The Justice Department has never publicly confirmed or denied this specific claim in a way that fully resolves the question. The identities of the two people Grassley referenced, if his information is accurate, have never been made public.
Whether they have surviving families who know exactly what happened to them, or families left wondering for years why someone they loved disappeared, remains something the public record simply does not answer. Sometimes, the most honest way to tell a story like this is to admit clearly where the documented facts stop and where the unanswered questions begin, and to let that unresolved space stand on its own, rather than filling it in with certainty the record does not support. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the fate of those two sources remains genuinely unresolved, the final case on this list returns to where this story began, closing the loop on the cartel that started it all, and the agent whose death forced an entire government to change how it fights the war on drugs. Section 12. Juan José Bernabe. 33 years is a long time to believe a story is finished. For 3 decades, Juan José Bernabe's name showed up in the record books as one of the men who paid for the kidnapping and murder of an American DEA agent. A life sentence sitting quietly alongside the convictions of his co-defendants as proof that the case had been closed for good. Then, in the spring of 2024, that story reopened. Not because anyone found new evidence of his innocence, but because the evidence that had convicted him in the first place stopped holding up. Before any of that, though, Bernabe had spent most of his adult life as two very different things at once: a police officer and a cartel bodyguard, sometimes on the same afternoon. Before he became one of the most consequential defendants in the history of American prosecutions against Mexican cartel violence, Bernabé worked in Mexican law enforcement, the kind of position that gave him legitimate access to weapons, vehicles, and official cover. That access made him useful to people who wanted exactly that kind of legitimacy attached to their operations. And at some point, Bernabé crossed over from officer to bodyguard, working personal security for Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, one of the founding leaders of the Guadalajara cartel. Fonseca Carrillo trusted Bernabé enough to keep him close, and that trust bought Bernabé a front-row seat to the cartel's daily operations, the kind of access that came with real protection, but also real exposure. Working security for a man at that level meant knowing who came and went from certain houses, which cars carried which cargo, and which conversations were not meant to be overheard by outsiders. It also meant being present, without necessarily choosing to be, whenever the cartel decided to handle a problem itself, rather than let the police or the courts handle it. Bernabé was not one of the cartel's decision-makers. He did not order anything, and nothing in the case against him suggested he had that kind of authority. But proximity to power in an organization built on secrecy and violence rarely stays neutral for long. And by the time the cartel decided how it wanted to respond to the DEA agent investigating its operations, Bernabé was already standing close enough to the center of that decision that walking away from it was no longer a realistic option, whether he wanted to or not. By the mid-1980s, that job had put Bernabé in the middle of one of the most violent chapters in the cartel's history. American authorities alleged that Bernabé was present outside a house in an upscale Guadalajara neighborhood in February 1985, standing guard while a kidnapped DEA agent was tortured inside. Prosecutors went further, alleging Bernabé may have taken part in the actual kidnapping itself.
They also alleged that in the chaotic days after the killing, Bernabé took part in an armed standoff with Mexican police at the Guadalajara airport, one that allowed Fonseca Carrillo's fellow cartel leader to escape the country entirely before authorities could arrest him. In the eyes of American prosecutors, Bernabé was not a bystander to any of this. He was a working piece of the machinery that carried it out. Bernabé eventually stood trial in the United States in 1990, in a case that drew national attention well beyond his own role in it. His co-defendants included another former cartel bodyguard named Javier Vázquez Velasco, a notorious Honduran trafficker named Juan Ramón Mata Ballesteros, and Rubén Zuno Arce, the brother-in-law of a former Mexican president.
That lineup turned the trial into one of the highest-profile prosecutions connected to the kidnapping, since it showed prosecutors were willing to go after politically connected defendants, and not just low-level enforcers. During the trial, Bernabé admitted to working as a bodyguard for Fonseca Carrillo, but denied any involvement in the kidnapping or murder itself. The jury did not believe him, or did not believe enough of his denial to matter. In 1991, Bernabé was convicted on 3 separate charges, 2 tied directly to the kidnapping and murder, and a third for acting as an accessory by helping a cartel leader escape Mexico in the aftermath. He was sentenced to life in prison on the kidnapping count, with 2 additional 10-year sentences layered on top of it. His co-defendants received their own outcomes from that same trial. Zuno Arce, whose family connections had made him the most politically sensitive name in the courtroom, was convicted on kidnapping charges, a verdict that sent a message at the time that even a former president's relative was not untouchable in an American court. Mata Ballesteros and Vázquez Velasco were also convicted,
on charges tied to their own specific roles, and both received lengthy sentences of their own. For more than 3 decades, all of these sentences stood together as one visible piece of the broader American response to a killing that had reshaped the entire relationship between the DEA and Mexico. A set of convictions that got cited again and again in later years, as proof that accountability for the case had actually been achieved, not just promised. That picture held until it didn't.
The case against Bernabe had relied heavily on forensic evidence presented at his 1990 trial, the kind of physical and scientific testimony that juries in that era were generally trained to treat as close to unimpeachable. Forensic science, especially the kind used in American courtrooms during the 1980s and early 1990s, has not aged well across many categories of evidence. Techniques that prosecutors and juries once treated as close to infallible, ranging from certain types of pattern analysis to specific methods of physical evidence interpretation, have since been re-examined nationally and found, in many cases, to rest on far shakier scientific ground than anyone realized at the time. Decades later, some of the specific techniques used to help convict Bernabe came under serious, sustained scrutiny of exactly this kind.
The details of which methods were challenged and how thoroughly they were undermined are not always spelled out cleanly in public reporting, but the practical result was unambiguous. The evidence that had helped put Bernabe away for life no longer held up to the same standard, and that opened a door that had been closed for more than 30 years. That re-examination did not happen quickly, and it did not happen because Bernabe himself launched some dramatic new legal campaign from behind bars. It happened the way most forensic reckonings happen in the American system. Slowly, through years of separate cases and separate scientific reviews, chipping away at techniques that had once been treated as settled fact. By the time those reviews caught up with Bernabe's specific conviction, he had already spent more than 30 years incarcerated for a crime connected to one of the most notorious killings in DEA history. And the legal machinery that reopened his case had nothing to do with claims of innocence in the ordinary sense. It had to do with whether the specific evidence used to convict him back in 1990 could still be trusted to mean what prosecutors said it meant at the time. In April of 2024, Juan José Bernabe, then 62 years old, was released from American custody. He did not walk free into the United States. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement delivered him directly to Mexican immigration officials on the bridge connecting El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, physically returning him to the country where the original crime had taken place. Court records showed no outstanding charges against him in Mexico, which meant Mexican authorities had no legal basis to detain him once he crossed the bridge. A man who had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in an American prison for his role in one of the most notorious crimes in DEA history walked back into Mexico a free man, more than 30 years after a jury decided otherwise. This is not a story about a cartel underestimating the reach of American law enforcement. It is closer to the opposite. A story about how far that reach can eventually stretch, and how much can still slip through it even after decades of what looked like settled accountability. Bernabe's conviction had been part of the broader reckoning that followed the kidnapping and murder of a DEA agent in 1985, one thread among several that seemed, for 30 years, to prove that the cartel's decision to target an American federal agent had cost it dearly. His release did not undo the convictions of his co-defendants, and it did not reopen the underlying case against the cartel leaders who ordered the killing in the first place. But it complicated the tidy version of the story, the one where every person connected to that crime eventually paid for it in full,
and stayed paid.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.